Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Microsoft Flight Simulator Flight School. In today's video we won't be hopping into Microsoft Flight Simulator, instead we'll be looking at a program called Skyvector and we'll be discussing how to plan a VFR navigational flight. Skyvector, for anyone that hasn't heard of it, is an absolutely brilliant free web-based flight planning tool. It's used for real-world flight planning but just as easily can be used within Flight Simulator. As I say, it's totally free, and in fact it doesn't even require an account to use, so I highly recommend checking it out, and that's what we'll be using in today's lesson. As always guys, I do hope you enjoy the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. That really helps the channel to grow. I really appreciate the support. But now let's jump into Skyvector and begin the lesson. Just before we get into the lesson, I would just like to mention it's a very important part of the process that you get yourself familiar with the chart symbology before actually starting the flight planning process itself. To do that, you can go into Skyvector, zoom in on the area of the United States in which you wish to fly, and click on the top right hand corner to select the specific navigational chart. You'll then find on the left of said chart that there will be the symbology and the legend explaining what each symbol means. I highly recommend going through all of that before you start the lesson if you wish to carry out navigational flights using real-world charts. Anyway, we'll now jump into Skyvector itself and begin the lesson. So here we are on the skyvector.com website. As you can see, Skyvector has global coverage for VFR navigational charts, as well as high and low IFR sectional charts. Whilst you do have global coverage for VFR navigation within Skyvector, most of the information given to you is quite crude in terms of definition. You'll see things like major towns, roads, railways and water features, as well as terrain. However, the finer details that you would get on a typical VFR navigation chart will be missing. The only exception to this is the United States. You'll see in just a second, but Skyvector gives us real-world VFR navigational charts within the entirety of the United States, which is primarily the reason I chose the United States for the Flight School series. So of course the first thing you want to figure out when you're planning your flight is the route that you intend to fly, and in today's flight we'll be flying from Bierce out towards the southwest towards Lake Greeson, then out towards the southeast towards the town of Delight, and finally northeast onto the town of Arkadelphia to land at Dexter B. Florence Memorial Field. So to start our flight planning within Skyvector, let's first find our departure airfield of Bierce. If you remember, the ICAO designation is 7 Mike 3. To find the airfield on the map, we can either scroll and zoom with the mouse wheel, or we can simply type in our departure airfield 7 Mike 3 and hit enter. Straight away that will home in on Bierce. We can then use the mouse wheel to scroll and zoom in towards the airfield. And automatically Skyvector will give us the correct navigational chart. However, we'll click on the top right to select the Memphis VFR chart. So here we have Bierce, as I mentioned, our departure airfield. And as I said, we want to fly out to the southwest towards Lake Greeson. Here we have Lake Greeson. We could pick any part of the lake, of course, for our waypoints. However, it's a good idea to pick an easily identifiable feature of the lake that will help you fly more accurately. So we'll pick this bottom southeastern corner of the lake, right on the tip. To add a waypoint, we just right click and then we hit plan on the GPS lat long fix. And that will add the waypoint to our flight plan. We'll do the same for the town of Delight out to the southeast. So we'll right click on the centre of the town and we'll hit plan. And then finally, as I mentioned, we're flying up towards the town of Arkadelphia, towards the Florence Memorial Airport. And again, we just right click on the airfield, this time clicking plan next to the Dexter B. Florence Memorial Field. Just worth mentioning as well, as you can see, you also get all the instrument approach plates throughout the United States for any airfields that have them. So once again, Skyvector, a really good resource, both for VFR and IFR flight planning. Anyway, we'll hit plan now, and that will complete our flight plan by entering Florence Memorial Airfield as the destination airport. Now that we have our route planned out in Skyvector, the next thing we need to consider is, can we actually fly the route that we want to fly? The two main considerations there are terrain and airspace. Obviously, if there's any significant high terrain on the route, particularly in the Cessna 152, it might be the case that we're unable to climb higher than said terrain, and so we'd have to reroute and find another way around to our destination. That's not the case today. We'll discuss terrain more in just a moment's time, but basically there's nothing that's going to prevent us from flying this route. And then finally, airspace, as I mentioned. I'm not an expert with the USA VFR navigational charts, but as you can see, we do have some airspace out to both the east and the west of our route. The airspace on the west is military airspace, and as you can see, it excludes any airspace below 1,500 feet above ground level and below. So in this case, for example, we have terrain up to around 1,100 feet, so this airspace would be starting around 2,600 feet. So we could choose to either fly underneath it, however we'd be quite close to the terrain below us. So instead today we've chosen to take a route that avoids the airspace altogether. Similarly, out to the east, I believe it's Class Echo airspace that we have here. And again, we've just chosen to take a route that avoids the airspace altogether. Again, we'll talk more about that later on in the video when we decide on our cruising altitude. So in terms of terrain and airspace, we're all good. The next thing we want to do is discuss the rest of the flight plan. So the next thing we need to enter is the aircraft's speed. As we already mentioned in previous lessons, the Cessna 152 cruises at a speed of around 90 knots. However, that's our indicated airspeed, and Skyvector would like to know our true airspeed. I won't get into too much detail between the two. Basically, your indicated airspeed is a measure of the air pressure as you fly through the air, whereas your true airspeed is the actual speed at which you're moving through the air. You can go away and read more online about the differences between the various types of airspeed measurement. However, a good rule of thumb is for every 1,000 feet that you climb, your true airspeed goes up by roughly 2% against your indicated airspeed. Again, we'll talk more about our cruise level in just a moment, but we'll be looking at a cruise level of around 4,000 feet for today's flight, so that'll be an extra 8% on top of our cruise indicated airspeed. Just to make the maths simple, we'll call it 10%, so we'll be looking at a true airspeed of 99 knots, and we'll just round that up to 100. So we have our speed now, 100 knots true airspeed, and finally we need to decide what altitude we want to cruise at. I believe the rule in the United States is you can cruise at any altitude you want up to an altitude of 3,000 feet, and thereafter, based on the VFR altitude rules, if we're heading between 000 and 179 degrees, we need to fly at an odd level plus 500. So for example 3,500, 5,500, etc. If we're between a course of 180 and 359 degrees, we need to fly at even plus 500. So 4,500, 6,500 and so on. So for today's flight, you can see initially we're departing out to the southwest, which puts us in the even cruise altitude range. To decide on your cruise altitude, again you need to consider the terrain and any obstacles en route, as well as any airspace. It might be that you can either fly over or under a particular section of airspace. The easiest way to get an idea of the terrain and obstacles en route is to look at these large numbers in the section of each grid square. Each grid square is denoted by these dashed lines along each outlined square. And again, the large number in the middle denotes the highest obstacle en route within that square. So for example, in this grid square, 2,600 feet being the highest obstacle. Ideally, of course, though, we don't want to fly it just at 2,600 feet. A good rule of thumb is to add an extra 1,000 feet on top of this figure. So that would be 3,600 feet. And then going off our altitude rules that we just mentioned previously, we'd look to cruise at 4,000 feet initially on the first leg of the journey. In the free version of Skyvector, we can only enter one cruise altitude. So we'll enter 4,000 feet now. And we'll hit enter. For the second leg of the flight, we'll now be in the odd plus 500 feet range, so we'll descend down to 3,500 feet towards the town of Delight, which will put us just below the 3,600 feet we mentioned there, but I'm happy with that. As you can see, we're moving away from the higher terrain anyway. On towards Arkadelphia, we'll descend again. This time we'll be down at the odd altitude range, so we'll descend down to 3,000 feet. As you can see, 1,900 feet is the highest obstacle within this particular grid square, which means plus the extra 1,000 feet, that's 2,900 feet. So more than happy with 3,000 feet for the final leg of the trip. So the flight plan is now filled out. The next thing we can do is we can either click on the top right hand button up here, and that will give us a brief outline of the flight plan with the leg, the heading we need to fly, the distance and the time of each leg. That provides a good enough guide to help you navigate throughout the flight. However, Skyvector does also provide a more in-depth navigation log, which we'll aim to use for the next lesson. So once again, clicking on the top right button, and we can come down to the bottom right and click on Nav Log. That will open up a navigation log for you in a new tab, and again you have basically the same information but now with a little bit more depth provided. So the first column we have each waypoint. We have BIRS, our two user fixes or our waypoints at both Greason Lake and the town of Delight, and then Kilo Alpha Delta Foxtrot, which is our arrival airfield. Skyvector does also give us the top of climb and top of descent. However, you'll probably find these are quite inaccurate, as again in the free version you can't make an aircraft specific flight, so it's just giving you a generic top of climb and descent. The next column we have our route altitude. Again, we can only enter one route altitude in the free version, so we just have 4,000 feet throughout. Next we have our wind direction and our wind speed. So you can see 192 at 2 knots initially, progressing to 206 degrees at 7 knots once we reach our top of climb, and a pretty slight wind throughout the flight, only around 6 or 7 knots. The wind data is important later on as we have to correct our headings to account for the drift caused by the wind. However, Skyvector does all the hard work for us there, so we'll just briefly discuss that in a moment. And then we have our temperatures, and both in terms of top of climb as well as our cruising temperature. Roughly 19 degrees today, which is roughly 11 degrees above ISA, which is the International Standard Atmosphere model. Again, you can go away and read more about that on Google should you wish to do so. Next we have our true airspeed. As you can see, the true airspeed slightly lower as we climb, and then 100 knots as we planned in the cruise. And Skyvector just given a slightly higher true airspeed, presumably accounting for the descent. Next we have our track. Our track is basically the course that we've plotted on the map in degrees, then corrected for the wind, so a wind correction angle. So you can see initially we have a course of 198 degrees with 0 correction angle, which gives us our true heading of 198 degrees. Similarly below, a track of 198 degrees plus 1 degree of correction for the wind. That gives us our true heading of 199 degrees, and so on. Again, calculating this in real life can be quite laborious if you do it all manually, but Skyvector doing all the hard work for us. Next we have our magnetic heading. This is the heading that we'll be flying using the aircraft's instruments. Both the compass and the directional gyro are referenced to magnetic north. Some of you may not be aware, but the Earth's magnetic pole is not actually located at the Earth's geographic North Pole, so we have to add in a correction to account for that. How do we do that? Well, we apply something called magnetic variation. Usually you can find the magnetic variation figure on the navigational chart. Again, Skyvector provides that for us with the variation column. So you can see in this part of the world the magnetic variation is -1 degree. And again, Skyvector's calculated this for us, so we have our true heading minus the 1 degree. That gives us a heading of 197, 198, 137, and so forth. The next column we have our ground speed. This is our true airspeed corrected for the wind conditions once again. So if we had a tailwind, we'd expect to see a higher ground speed, and vice versa, if we had a headwind, we'd expect to see a lower ground speed. As you can see, we have a lower ground speed in the climb. That's because obviously we're climbing at a slower speed initially. In the cruise, initially we have a lower ground speed than our true airspeed, which means we have a headwind component initially. And later on in the flight that becomes a tailwind component as we head into Arkadelphia. Next we have the distance of each leg. Again, this is split up to account for the top of climb. As you can see, it's roughly 23 nautical miles to the first waypoint, 12 nautical miles to the second waypoint, and then 22 nautical miles to destination. Skyvector then calculates an estimated time en route for each leg, and again we could add these two up to check from the departure point to the first waypoint, roughly 16 minutes, 7.2 minutes for the second leg, and 13 minutes for the final leg. So that's all we need in the flight plan for now. We also have a fuel column that we can fill out during the flight. This will allow us to monitor our actual fuel burn versus our calculated fuel burn. I'll come back to fuel in just a second. So coming back to the chart itself to now work out our fuel burn for the flight. You can see in the overall summary we have a distance for the flight of 56.5 miles, and with today's wind conditions that gives us a flight time of 37 minutes. We're not going to go into great depth on the fuel calculations for the flight, but I'll teach you how to do a pretty broad calculation, which will be good enough for the vast majority of your flights within the simulator. So the first thing we need to know is the fuel burn of the aircraft. You can either find this out in the pilot's operating handbook of the aircraft that you're using in the sim, or if you don't have one available to you, you can usually find out a pretty reasonable figure on Google. The Cessna 152 burns 7 US gallons per hour of fuel, and as we can see today's flight is 37 minutes long. So to make the maths easy, let's call that a 40-minute flight. So to calculate our fuel we divide 7 by 60, and that shows we're burning 0.117 US gallons per minute, and then we can just times that by 40, and that shows we're burning 4.67 US gallons for the flight. It's always good to add an additional safety margin onto your fuel figure, so we'll times that by 1.05 to give us an extra 5%, and that gives us 4.9 US gallons for the flight. And again, just for an extra little margin there, we'll round that up to 5 US gallons. So we know that from Bierce to Florence Memorial Airport we're going to burn 5 US gallons. And of course we don't want to arrive at destination with absolutely minimal fuel. So again, a good rule of thumb is to arrive with an extra hour of fuel where you can. As we already mentioned, it's 7 US gallons an hour, so we'll add 7 onto our 5 US gallons. And of course that will give us 12 US gallons for the flight. So that's all our flight planning now completed within Skyvector. The last thing that I would highly recommend that you do, if you're new to VFR navigation, is to study the route before you actually fly it, and try and find any useful features that you might use for navigation throughout the flight. That will not only help you navigate more accurately during the flight, but it will also help you to reduce your workload somewhat, and helps you to keep ahead of the aircraft mentally throughout the flight. So coming back to our planned route now, we'll just briefly discuss the sort of features that we'll be looking for throughout the flight. It's always good to try and find some large features that will give you an overall idea of your orientation. So for example, on our departure out of Bierce, we have Lake Washita behind us, and we'll be expecting as we head towards the southwest to see the lake at about our 7 o'clock. Straight away we'll be passing over some high terrain, passing over this first ridgeline, then a valley and then another ridgeline. And we'll be passing shortly thereafter across this road at Caddo Gap. We'll have the town of Glenwood out on our left, a couple of obstacles there, they might be masts, and an ultralight field just off the left wing. It'll be very important to accurately navigate on this leg of the trip, as we do have the airspace to either side of us. So we'll make sure that we fly either over the top of or just to the right of this ultralight airfield if we can spot it. We've also got this slight curve in the road coming off from Glenwood. We'll make sure, using these two features, that we are on track and we're not drifting off course towards either piece of airspace. We should be able to see Lake Realism from a fairly good distance away, so this will be a great aid for navigation. Again, a very good gross error check to make sure that we are heading in the right direction. In terms of more refined features, we'll be following this road towards Kirby initially, and then we'll be heading towards the edge of Lake Realism, as I mentioned earlier. Again, the edge of the lake, a pretty good feature on its own, but we've also got 2 small islands out in the larger section of the lake, so we'll be able to very easily confirm whether or not we're at the right point in the lake. We'll then make our turn out to the southeast, again crossing over a road. We'll have a couple of obstacles out on the left wing, and we might be able to see the town of Murfreesboro out on the right. Heading towards Delight, that should be quite an obvious town. It's fairly secluded and on its own. We've got a road passing up from the south and a road passing through east to west, and it looks like some railway tracks out to the east as well, with the town of Antoine in the middle. Once we're over the town of Delight, we'll head out to the east towards Arkadelphia. Again, quite a big town. It should be easy to spot from a fairly long distance. Otherwise they're a little bit more sparse in terms of features. We have this road running out from Antoine towards Hollywood, so we'll try and keep an eye out for that. And we have all these obstacles out to the southeast, which we should see off the right wing. And a nice big feature for us, we have Highway 30 passing out to the west of the town of Arkadelphia. We've also got the railway running in past the airfield, so by using these two features we should be able to pick them up and follow them up towards the airport. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of the sort of features that you should look for when planning the flight. Again, if you're new to the whole process, it's worth perhaps writing down certain features next to each waypoint on your navigation log so that you have a good reminder of what to look for on the route. Anyway, that's all for this lesson. Hopefully that gives you a better idea of how to plan a VFR flight, specifically using Skyvector. As I said, a really amazing website. Once again, I highly recommend checking it out. I do hope you found the video useful, guys. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, please leave them down in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Once again, in the next lesson, we'll come back and we'll carry out the flight that we've just planned. But for now, thanks very much, and I'll see you all again soon.